The first time my new neighbor asked if there was room in my bed, she was standing in my hallway at exactly 17 inches the morning. She was completely barefoot, soaked from the knees down, and holding a dead houseplant against her chest like it was a wounded soldier rescued from a battlefield. At that exact moment, I had known her for precisely 9 hours. That was just long enough to know her name was Claire. It was long enough to know she drank gas station coffee with the absolute seriousness of a woman negotiating a peace treaty with life itself. And it was long enough to know that when she looked at me with those tired, green eyes and asked that impossible question, my answer was going to shatter the quiet, sterile little life I had been pretending to enjoy for the last 2 years. My name is Ryan Keller. I was 32 years old, divorced, and I had carefully built my days around a predictable routine of residential project management, cardboard takeout boxes, and the kind of peace that looks incredibly healthy from a distance, but is really just loneliness with clean countertops. I worked for a small renovation company in Asheville, North Carolina. My world was defined by old historic houses, crooked hardwood floors, stubborn cast iron plumbing, clients with infinite Pinterest boards, and entirely unrealistic budgets. I liked fixing things because wood, tile, and busted pipes were completely honest. They never told you they loved you in the warmth of April, and then suddenly decided, by the chill of November, that marriage felt far too heavy to carry. So, when apartment 3B across the hall finally got rented after sitting empty for 6 long months, I told myself I didn't care. Then Claire moved in on a humid Thursday afternoon. I first saw her from my doorway, struggling with a heavy cardboard box labeled kitchen and ab taxes. It seemed like a desperate cry for help and a tragic financial confession all at the same time. She was wearing faded jeans, a blue t-shirt, and her hair was twisted into one of those messy knots that looked entirely accidental but somehow made her prettier than anyone had a right to be while sweating through a move. She glanced up and caught me watching. She didn't look embarrassed. Instead, she leaned against the wall and sighed. She told me I could either help her carry the boxes or pretend I wasn't actively judging her highly questionable packing system. I leaned against my own doorframe, crossing my arms. I told her I was actually admiring it because it takes real courage to put tax documents right next to silverware. She didn't miss a beat. She called it emotional balance, introduced herself as Claire from 3B, and informed me that the box was significantly heavier than her last relationship. I smiled, telling her I hadn't actually offered to help yet. She laughed, telling me that opening a door in the American South automatically counts as an invitation. I really should have shut my door right then and gone back to my cold leftover Thai food. Instead, I stepped into the hallway and took the box from her hands. Her apartment smelled like fresh cardboard, lemon-scented cleaner, and the faint scent of rain from the dark storm clouds gathering over the mountains outside. The space was completely empty of life. She had almost no furniture to speak of, just a single green velvet armchair, a precarious stack of books, 3 mismatched floor lamps, and a queen-sized mattress still tightly wrapped in thick moving plastic, leaning against the bare living room wall. I set the box down and asked if she was moving in all alone, immediately hating myself for how personal the question sounded. Claire gave me a sharp look over her shoulder, asking if I was taking a local census or simply checking the neighborhood competition. I almost dropped the box in surprise, which made her laugh. Right then, something deep in my chest shifted, something I had kept packed away, far better than any of her kitchen dishes. She apologized, explaining that she became incredibly sarcastic when she was completely exhausted. I told her that I usually just became completely quiet. She smiled, noting that my coping mechanism sounded significantly healthier, even if it was far less entertaining. She looked at me then with a real smile. It wasn't a polite, practiced, neighborly smile. It was quick, crooked, and completely genuine, like she hadn't actually meant to let it slip out. That was the exact moment I realized she was beautiful. It wasn't the obvious, striking kind of beauty that people use when they can't think of a better descriptive word. She was beautiful in distinct, unforgettable pieces. It was the tiny, pale scar cutting through her left eyebrow. It was the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, even though it immediately fell right back into her face a second later. It was the steady, observant intelligence in her eyes, like she was constantly reading the room and calculating exactly how much of herself it actually deserved. We managed to carry up 6 more heavy boxes before the summer rain finally started pouring down. By the time we finished with the last one, we were both damp from the humidity and breathing hard in the narrow hallway. She leaned back against her front door, wiping her forehead. She joked that if I was this incredibly helpful with every single new neighbor, she was going to have to assume I was hiding a dark, terrible secret. I told her that I actually did have one. Her eyebrows lifted in curiosity. I confessed that I owned a professional label maker, NE5. Claire pressed her hand to her chest in mock relief. She told me that a label maker wasn't a dark secret at all. It was absolute marriage material. The word hit me completely wrong. It wasn't because she meant anything serious by it. She didn't. It was just a harmless passing joke tossed between two strangers standing a little too close in a hallway that smelled of rain and old paper. But my expression must have changed instantly because her smile completely softened. She apologized quietly, calling it a bad joke. I shook my head, telling her it was just a lot of old, heavy history. She studied my face for half a second, lingering longer than strangers usually ever do, and whispered that she had a lot of that old history too. For a long moment, neither of us looked away. Then, a massive crack of thunder boomed directly over the roof, loud enough to physically rattle the window panes in their wooden frames. The hallway lights flickered violently before buzzing back to life. Claire pointed up at the ceiling, pleading with me to tell her that this charming old historic building wasn't held together entirely by good vibes and landlord optimism. I looked up and told her the truth. It was mostly just landlord optimism. She groaned playfully, lamenting that she had just signed a strict one-year lease with a man who had confidently described the building's water pressure as spirited. I laughed out loud, and she joined in. That really should have been the absolute end of it. It was a nice, polite meeting, a bit of witty banter, and a strange, sudden spark that I knew I could easily ignore. After all, I was an expert at ignoring sparks before they had the chance to turn into dangerous fires. By 9 that night, the world outside had dissolved into a heavy, oppressive blackness. The storm was no longer just gathering, it had officially arrived, throwing sheets of wind-driven water against my kitchen window. I sat at my wooden table under the warm, steady glow of a single pendant light, staring at a set of blueprints for a kitchen remodel on Montfort Avenue. I was meticulously checking cabinet measurements down to the exact 16th of an inch. It was quiet, repetitive, and entirely predictable, exactly the way I preferred my evenings. Then, a sudden heavy thud vibrated through the drywall, separating my kitchen from apartment 3B. I paused, my pencil hovering over the paper. A second later, another dull thud echoed, followed by the faint, muffled sound of Claire's voice. It was sharp, frustrated, and entirely clear through the thin historic walls. No, 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 absolutely not. I stood up, leaving the blueprints on the table. Before I could even take a step toward the hallway, a frantic, uneven knock rattled my front door. When I swung it open, Claire was standing under the dim hallway light. She was holding a damp white towel squeezed tightly against her chest. Her cheeks were flushed a deep, agitated pink, and her dark hair had completely escaped its messy knot, falling in wild, damp strands around her face. She looked at me, exhaling a breath that was half laugh and half sigh. She apologized immediately, stating that she absolutely hated being the problematic neighbor on day 1 of her lease. Then, she paused and asked if I knew anything about building radiators. I leaned against the doorframe, looking at the towel in her hands. I reminded her that it was the middle of July. She rolled her eyes, her characteristic sarcasm flashing through her obvious exhaustion. She said she was fully aware of the calendar and that the seasonal mismatch was precisely why she was so deeply concerned. I didn't say anything else. I simply grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from my utility closet and followed her across the hall into apartment 3B. The moment I stepped over her threshold, I could hear it, a steady, rhythmic hissing sound coming from the back of her bedroom. A dark sheen of water was already spreading across the original heart pine floorboards, bubbling up from an old, corroded iron pipe right near the baseboard. It wasn't a catastrophic, dramatic flood yet, but it was more than enough to completely soak the bottom edge of her plastic-wrapped mattress and turned two of her nearby cardboard boxes into a soggy, disintegrating mess of paper mache. I knelt down, shining the beam of my flashlight onto the rusty metal joint. I told her the shut-off valves for this specific vertical line were almost certainly located in the basement. Claire stood in the center of the room, staring at the growing puddle on her floor, and then turned her green eyes toward me. She sighed, remarking that of course the valves were in the basement, because it was absolutely mandatory that her very first night in the building include a trip into a dark subterranean dungeon. I stood up, wiping a stray drop of water from my jeans, and told her I would go handle it. She shook her head, immediately stepping into the hallway ahead of me. She announced that she was coming along. I turned to her, telling her she really didn't have to do that, but she completely cut me off. She reminded me that she had only known me for exactly 9 hours. While I seemed incredibly nice, she was absolutely not sending a strange man she just met into a dark basement on her behalf, especially since that was the literal opening scene of every true crime documentary. I couldn't argue with that logic. I nodded, admitting her point was completely fair. We walked down the creaking central stairwell together. I held the flashlight out in front of us because the overhead hallway lights had begun to flicker rhythmically again, struggling against the power grid. The air grew progressively cooler and heavier as we descended, eventually giving way to the distinct, unmistakable smell of an old Asheville basement, a mixture of damp earth, centuries-old dust, dried masonry, and ancient, forgotten paint cans. Claire stayed incredibly close to me on the narrow wooden steps, so close that her bare shoulder lightly brushed against my arm with every step we took. I deliberately told myself she was only walking that close because she was afraid of the dark, but my heart wasn't entirely believing the lie. Just as we reached the bottom of the flight, her foot slipped slightly on the smooth, damp concrete of the final step. Without thinking, she reached out and tightly grabbed my forearm to steady herself. Her hand was ice cold against my skin, but her grip was remarkably strong. I stopped moving, turning the beam of the flashlight toward the floor so I wouldn't blind her. I asked if she was okay. She nodded quickly, murmuring that she was fine, but she didn't let go of my arm right away. For a few seconds, her fingers remained locked around my forearm, her touch a solid, warm pressure in the vast, echoing darkness of the basement. I finally cleared my throat and moved toward the back wall, tracing the maze of exposed copper and iron pipes running along the low ceiling. I found the main valve for the eastern side of the building, gripped the cold iron wheel, and threw my weight into it. The old metal groaned loudly, a high-pitched screech of protest that echoed off the stone foundation before finally turning completely smooth. Somewhere deep in the ceiling above us, the rushing sound of water slowed to a dull, dripping stop. Claire let out a long, slow exhale, her shoulders visibly dropping. She looked at me through the shadows and remarked that I had now completely ruined her elaborate plan to remain deeply mysterious to her new neighbors. I smiled, shining the flashlight at a pile of old bricks, and asked if she actually had a plan. She told me she did. Her plan had been to move in quietly, be exceptionally elegant, and immediately own proper window curtains. Instead, I pointed out, she had arrived in a torrential downpour with a single box labeled kitchen and maybe taxes. She laughed softly, her grip finally sliding off my arm. She admitted that despite her best efforts, the mystery had apparently remained. By the time we made our way back up the stairs and entered her apartment, the storm outside had broken wide open. Violent cracks of thunder rattled the glass, and the rain was hammering against the windows like a handful of gravel thrown against the building. Claire's bedroom was technically usable, but only if you possessed a heavy mop, a large industrial fan, and the absolute emotional resilience of an old-world saint. Her queen mattress, however, had undoubtedly taken the absolute worst of the damage. The thick, moving plastic had torn open during the chaotic haul up the stairs, and one entire bottom corner was completely soaked through, darkened by the rusty radiator water. She stood frozen in the bedroom doorway, staring silently at the damp fabric. For the very first time all day, the quick, defensive jokes completely vanished from her face. She looked small, tired, and deeply overwhelmed. She whispered that she could easily just sleep through the night in her green velvet chair. I looked past her at the armchair. It was visually stunning, but it was very clearly designed by a modern minimalist who harbored a deep, personal hatred for the human spine. I told her there was absolutely no way she was doing that. I wasn't going to take her bed, she countered, because she knew I only had a living room couch. I stepped into her line of sight, looking directly at her. I told her I was completely serious about her not sleeping in that chair. Something intense and unspoken passed between us in that quiet doorway. It wasn't just basic neighborly politeness anymore, and it wasn't just standard human decency. It was a sudden, heavy awareness that we were completely alone in a half-unpacked apartment in the middle of a midnight storm, both of us actively pretending that the very air in the room hadn't completely changed its weight. She hugged her damp towel even tighter against her chest, looking down at the floorboards. She confessed, almost too quietly to hear, that she was actually supposed to be completely gone by the time morning arrived. I blinked in surprise, the word echoing in my head. I asked her what she meant by gone. Her mouth immediately tightened in a sharp line of regret, as if she desperately wished she could pull the words back into her throat. She swallowed hard and explained that she had given herself a deadline. She had planned to decide tonight, in the absolute quiet of her first evening, if she actually had the courage to stay in this city. I asked her why she wouldn't stay. Claire looked around her empty living room, her eyes lingering on the stacked cardboard boxes, the glistening wet floorboards, the ruined mattress, and then, finally, she brought her gaze back to me. She said that starting over always sounds incredibly brave and romantic, until the very first night actually arrives. Because when the darkness comes, it doesn't feel brave at all. It just feels like sleeping in a completely strange room, with every single one of your past mistakes stacked neatly around you. There it was. That was the raw, bleeding truth she had been hiding beneath her sharp wall of sarcasm all afternoon. And the terrible thing was, I knew that exact feeling far too well. I remembered the very first night after my ex-wife had packed her bags and left our house. I had spent the entire night sitting flat on the hardwood floor of my completely empty living room, simply because the master bed felt far too large and far too honest to sleep in alone. Nobody ever bothers to tell you that silence has a literal physical weight until you find yourself completely trapped underneath it. I took a slow step closer to her. I didn't crowd her space. I just wanted her to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that I wasn't going to make her carry the heavy weight of that honesty all by herself. I looked at her and told her that she didn't have to decide her entire life tonight. Claire looked up at me, the green in her eyes catching the faint light from the hallway. She smiled a tiny, fragile smile and whispered that my advice sounded exactly like something a man with beautifully labeled storage bins would say. I shrugged, a small smile breaking through my own gravity. I told her that I contained multitudes. Her laugh was incredibly soft this time, completely devoid of any sharp edges, and right at that exact second, the power grid finally gave out. The entire building plunged into total, pitch-black darkness, leaving nothing but the rhythmic, gray pulse of sheet lightning illuminating the windows. Claire made a small, startled sound in her throat. Without thinking, without analyzing the consequences, I reached out my hand into the dark. Her fingers found mine almost instantly. She didn't grab my hand out of fear. She took it gently, holding on as if she had been standing there in the dark, quietly waiting for permission to touch another human being. We stood completely frozen in the blackness of her living room, the torrential rain violently lashing the glass, her small fingers fitting into mine with a kind of absolute quiet that felt infinitely more dangerous than the thunder shaking the roof. After a few long, breathless seconds, she leaned slightly closer, her breath warm against my shoulder, and whispered those 7 words. "Is there room in your bed?" My heart kicked once against my ribs, hard and heavy. I knew I had choices. I could have easily made a quick, clever joke to break the tension. I could have safely hidden behind traditional manners and neighborly boundaries. I could have confidently told her that my living room couch was perfectly fine, keeping both of us safely on our own designated sides of the apartment wall. Instead, I listened to my own voice, cut through the dark, completely detached from my usual caution. I told her, yes. Claire's hand tightened remarkably fast around mine. But before the cold, familiar fear of vulnerability could talk me out of absolute honesty, I added one more thing. I told her I would only say yes if she promised not to leave tomorrow. The very next flash of bright lightning illuminated her face through the window, lasting just long enough for me to see her expression shift entirely. It wasn't shock, and it wasn't awkward embarrassment. It was something I hadn't expected to see. It was pure, unfiltered hope. And then, someone began to violently pound on her front door. Part 3. Shadows, labeled drawers, and broken frameworks. The heavy pounding on Claire's door didn't stop. It shattered the tight, fragile quiet that had settled over us like heavy wool. Claire's fingers instantly jerked within my grip, her skin turning even colder against mine, but she refused to break the physical connection. We stood completely motionless in the dark apartment, our breathing shallow, listening to the wood groan under the force of the blows. I looked down, searching for the pale outline of her face in the intermittent, gray strobes of lightning dancing across the walls. I asked her in a low whisper if she was expecting anyone at this hour. She let out a shaky, breathy laugh that barely carried across the room. She whispered back that the only person who would show up at 1 o'clock in the morning during a severe summer storm would be one of her past bad decisions, assuming those decisions had somehow learned how to knock on doors. I made a move toward the front entrance, intending to handle whoever was disrupting the night, but she moved in perfect synchronization with me. She kept her grip tight, anchored to my hand, as if her life depended on staying attached to my side. She stopped me with a soft, urgent utterance of my name. In the thick shadow, I could barely discern the sharp angles of her jaw, but the tight, trembling tension in her slender fingers told me everything I needed to know. She told me that if the person on the other side of that door happened to be her ex-husband, I shouldn't try to do anything heroic. That single sentence instantly delivered 3 distinct, heavy truths straight to my brain. First, Claire had not packed up her entire life and moved across the state to Asheville simply to enjoy the scenic mountain views and the local artisan culture. Second, she was currently terrified enough of her past that she was willing to confess her fear out loud to a man she had met less than half a day ago. And third, some incredibly reckless, deeply buried part of my own heart already desperately wanted to be heroic for her, regardless of the consequences. Instead of articulating any of those thoughts, I simply squeezed her hand back, giving her a steady, grounding pressure. I asked her what she wanted me to do. She went completely silent. It wasn't because she didn't have an answer. It felt more like nobody had bothered to ask her what she actually wanted in a very long time. Before she could find her voice, another loud, impatient knock rattled the wooden frame. This time, a muffled male voice called out from the hallway, identifying himself as Mark from the apartment directly downstairs. He shouted that water was actively dripping through his bedroom ceiling. The moment the name left his mouth, Claire's shoulders dropped with a relief, so sudden and profound, I felt almost guilty for witnessing it. She breathed out that it wasn't her ex, unless her ex had miraculously changed his name to Mark and secretly moved into the apartment below hers. I told her that if that were the case, I would personally help her relocate to the moon. She finally pulled her hand from mine and opened the front door. Mark from 2B was standing under the dim, flickering emergency light of the hallway. He was wearing a bright yellow raincoat, thrown carelessly over a pair of classic blue and white striped pajamas, and he was holding a large stainless steel mixing bowl tightly against his chest. Rainwater from his own ceiling dripped into the bowl at irregular, metallic intervals, and he looked both thoroughly soaked and deeply offended by the entire situation. He stopped, his eyes darting back and forth between Claire and me, taking in our disheveled appearance in the dark room. He paused, asking if he had accidentally interrupted something important. Claire immediately blurted out, "No," while I spoke over her at the exact same moment, confidently saying, "Yes." Claire turned her head slowly toward me in the dim light. Even in the absolute darkness of the power outage, I could distinctly see her left eyebrow lift in sharp amusement. I cleared my throat, trying to salvage my dignity, and added that we were right in the middle of dealing with the broken radiator pipe. Mark looked at us, his expression completely unconvinced, in a way that I honestly respected. We spent the next few minutes explaining the layout of the old shut-off valves in the basement, while Mark gave us an incredibly detailed lecture on the exact historical value of his ruined plaster ceiling. The summer storm outside chose that exact moment to explain itself, throwing a massive gust of wind that slammed rain against the building like a handful of coarse gravel. When I finally agreed to go downstairs with Mark to assess the damage to his apartment, Claire insisted on joining us. She walked closely beside me in the narrow concrete stairwell, her shoulder occasionally bumping mine, the back of her bare hand lightly brushing against my knuckles as we descended. She leaned in, her voice a quiet murmur beneath the sound of the thunder. She whispered that just so we were completely clear, she wanted to know what exactly we were interrupting when I said yes out there in the hallway. I looked at her, my voice low and steady. I told her we were interrupting my very best attempt at being completely honest. She looked away, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth, and noted that honesty sounded incredibly dangerous. I agreed, telling her it absolutely was. And the part where I told her not to leave tomorrow, I added, was by far the most dangerous part of all. She glanced back at me, her green eyes serious for a fraction of a second, and reminded me that I barely knew anything about her. I told her I knew enough. She countered that she could easily turn out to be a terrible person. I reminded her that she had deliberately labeled a moving box with both kitchen and taxes, so I had already assumed she possessed a certain level of beautiful madness. A genuine laugh slipped out of her before she could catch it. She reached out and nudged my shoulder with hers, a tiny, insignificant physical gesture that nonetheless felt like a deliberate choice to draw closer. We spent 20 tedious minutes in apartment 2B, ensuring the water leak had completely stopped. Mark turned out to be far more dramatic than actually endangered, and once he had placed two large plastic bowls underneath the dripping spots in his ceiling, he dramatically announced to the room that he would manage to survive the night if the structural integrity of the building and the grace of God allowed it. When Claire and I finally walked back up to the third floor, her apartment smelled damp, hollow, and completely defeated. My place, sitting right across the narrow hallway, was entirely dark but perfectly dry. She stood directly between our two open doors, looking down at the worn carpet as if the hallway floorboards were a heavily guarded border crossing between two different nations. She looked up and told me I didn't have to go through with this, reiterating that she could easily sleep in her velvet chair. I shook my head, tired of the back-and-forth defense mechanisms. I told her she couldn't sleep there. She countered that she would just sleep on her own floor. I reminded her that her floors were original hardwood and entirely unforgiving. She sighed, joking that she would simply develop an entirely new personality overnight and learn to enjoy physical discomfort. I stopped her by simply saying her name, Claire. She went completely still, the playful argument dying in her throat. I unlocked my door, pushed it open, and stepped aside, inviting her into my space. For a long, heavy moment, she only stared at me, evaluating the invisible risks. Then, she took a breath and walked past me into the dark apartment. My place was cleaner than any bachelor's apartment had a right to be at 48 inches the morning. The power was still entirely out, so I navigated my way to the kitchen and opened a drawer, pulling out a box of thick emergency candles. Yes, the drawer was neatly labeled, a fact that didn't escape her notice as I struck a match and lit 3 of them. A warm, amber light immediately flickered across the living room walls, instantly softening the sharp edges of the room. While I walked down the short hallway to the laundry room to grab some fresh towels and a clean, dry shirt for her to change into, Claire wandered over to my large wooden bookshelf. She traced the spines of the novels with her fingertips, noting aloud that I chose to alphabetize my collection strictly by the author's last name. I called out from the linen closet, telling her it was simply a logical system. She laughed, calling me a deeply suspicious and calculated man. I walked back into the living room and added that I also separated my loose screws by size in the utility room. She looked over her bare shoulder, a bright spark in her green eyes, and told me to stop flirting so aggressively. I nearly dropped the clean clothes right there on the floor. She smiled beautifully, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted once again. It didn't turn into something safe or predictable. It turned into something entirely alive. I handed her the oversized gray t-shirt, pointing toward the bathroom on the left, telling her she could change out of her wet jeans while I set up my spot on the living room couch. Her fingers lightly brushed against mine as she took the soft fabric from my hands, that she looked directly at me and noted that I kept offering to sleep on the couch because it was the proper, gentlemanly thing to do. Then, she paused, her voice dropping an octave, and asked what would happen if she didn't actually want me on the couch. My pulse instantly lost its steady rhythm. A soft, delicate pink hue rushed into Claire's cheeks, but she stubbornly refused to look away from my gaze. She swallowed hard, letting out a small, self-deprecating laugh, and clarified that she didn't mean anything improper. She simply meant that she trusted me, which she admitted was entirely ridiculous given that we had met just 9 hours ago. But she did trust me, and she simply did not want to be alone in the dark tonight. The raw, unfiltered honesty in her voice hit me significantly harder than any playful flirtation ever could. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, deliberately giving her physical space because every instinct in my body was screaming at me to take a step closer to her. I looked at her through the candlelight and promised her that I wouldn't leave her alone. Her eyes softened completely. She turned and disappeared into the bathroom, shutting the door quietly behind her. When she finally emerged a few minutes later, she was wearing my oversized gray t-shirt. Her damp jeans were gone, and her dark hair was hanging entirely loose around her shoulders, completely free of the constraints of the day. The moment she stepped into the living room, every single reasonable, protective thought that I had ever cultivated over the last 2 years quietly packed its bags and exited through the nearest window. The hem of the shirt fell to the middle of her thighs, and she nervously tugged at the fabric, telling me not to say a single word. I crossed my arms, a slow smile growing on my face, and told her I wasn't planning on saying anything at all. She pointed a finger at me, accusing me of having a very expressive face. I told her I had been informed of that defect before. She claimed my face was actively saying things in the silence specifically, that it was telling her she looked incredibly good in my clothes. I took a long, deliberate look at her standing there in the warm, amber glow of the candles. I met her gaze and told her the truth. She absolutely did. The playful teasing instantly evaporated from the space between us. Claire held my gaze as the candlelight caught the vibrant green of her eyes, and she whispered a quiet thank you. But as the rain continued to fall outside, it sounded like she was thanking me for something much larger than just a dry t-shirt. Part 4. The intrusion of tulips and the ghost at the threshold. We ended up sitting on my bed above the covers, our backs against the sturdy wooden headboard. There was a respectful foot of empty space between us, an invisible barrier that somehow felt significantly more intimate than physical touching. The heavy rain filled the surrounding silence, a constant hum that isolated my apartment from the rest of the world. The single candle on my dresser flickered softly, casting long, dancing shadows across Claire's bare knees. The quietness seemed to invite honesty, and after a while she began to talk. She told me her ex-husband's name was Daniel. She stated explicitly that he hadn't hit her, not a single time, and she explained that she always felt a strange need to lead with that detail so people would understand why leaving him had been so incredibly difficult. He didn't use physical force, she whispered. He just made her smaller, one single comment at a time. She stared down at her small hands, her voice dropping into a flat, clear tone. She told me that, according to him, her laugh was always far too loud for public spaces. Her job at a small marketing firm wasn't impressive enough to mention at dinner parties. Her childhood friends were bad influences, and her clothes were always trying too hard to capture attention. She confessed that eventually, she simply started editing her entire personality before he even had a chance to do it for her. She had spent years shrinking herself to fit into the narrow box he had designed for her life. A sudden flash of sharp anger rose up in my chest, clean and hot. I hated a man I had never met, purely because of the quiet exhaustion in her voice. But I knew instinctively that she didn't need my anger or my protective rage right now. She simply needed someone to sit in the dark and hear her truth without trying to fix it. So, I looked over at her through the amber light and told her that I genuinely liked her laugh. She turned her head to look at me, her green eyes wide and vulnerable in the shadow. I added that I also liked her clothes that allegedly tried too hard, even though that single cardboard box had done the majority of the heavy lifting today. I smiled, telling her I even liked the fact that she confidently bossed complete strangers into carrying her heavy belongings up 3 flights of stairs. She corrected me instantly, a tiny spark of her usual sarcasm returning to her voice. She whispered that she only bossed neighbors around, not total strangers. I smiled back, conceding the point. Right then, her bare foot lightly nudged mine under the edge of the blanket. It wasn't an accidental movement. It was a deliberate, quiet bridge built across that foot of empty space. She whispered that she still didn't know if she possessed the courage to stay in Asheville permanently. But when I had told her in the dark hallway that I wanted her to stay, she had desperately wanted to believe me. I shifted my position slightly, turning my right-hand palm up on the blank space between us. It was an open invitation, completely devoid of pressure. Claire looked down at my hand for a long, quiet second. Then, she slowly slid her fingers into mine. This time, there was no sudden storm excuse, no dark basement to justify the contact, and no lingering fear of the dark. It was just a conscious choice made by a woman deciding to touch another person on her own terms. I looked at her and told her that I had meant every single word I said. Her thumb moved gently over my knuckles, tracing the skin. She whispered that I shouldn't make heavy offers like that to women who were currently trying very hard not to completely fall apart. I shook my head, my grip remaining steady and warm. I told her I wasn't offering her a place because she was falling apart. I looked at her with my heart completely open, feeling foolish but entirely awake for the first time in years. I told her I was making the offer simply because I had liked exactly who she was before I ever knew she needed a single thing from me. Claire went completely still. The silence stretched between us, heavy and sweet. Then, she leaned across that careful foot of space and gently kissed my cheek. It wasn't a kiss on the mouth, not yet, but her lips lingered against my skin for one long second longer than necessary, leaving a warm imprint that seemed to settle deep under my skin. When she pulled back, her green eyes were incredibly bright. She whispered that the gesture was my official warning. I asked her what she was warning me about. Her mouth curved into a quick, crooked smile as she looked at me through the dim candlelight. She whispered that she might actually decide to stay. Claire did stay. It didn't happen in the dramatic, sweeping way Hollywood movies always try to portray. There was no grandiose sunrise confession, no swelling emotional music, and no sudden, magical certainty that the universe had perfectly rearranged itself for our happiness. Instead, there was just the quiet, pale morning light slowly filtering through my window blinds, a distinct stiffness in my neck from sleeping entirely upright against the headboard, and the solid comfort of Claire's head resting against my shoulder. At some completely forgotten point during the early hours of the morning, the careful, respectful space we had maintained between us had entirely disappeared. Her dark hair smelled faintly of the summer rain and my own laundry detergent. Her small hand was curled loosely around the fabric of my t-shirt, holding on even in the depths of sleep, as if she had reached out for me in the dark and quietly decided I was a piece of reality worth keeping. I didn't move a single muscle. I barely allowed myself to breathe, terrified that any sudden movement would break the fragile peace of the room. After a few minutes, she stirred against me, her eyelashes fluttering open. She blinked against the morning light and looked up at me from only 2 inches away for one beautiful, unguarded second. A genuine smile broke across her face. Then, her eyes suddenly widened in realization, and she let out a soft groan. I frowned playfully, telling her that a groan wasn't exactly the enthusiastic reaction a man hopes for first thing in the morning. She buried her face slightly in my shoulder, complaining that she had slept completely on top of me. I informed her that I had noticed the fact all night long, or at least for the vast majority of it. She peeked up, nervously asking if she had drooled on my shirt. I smiled down at her, telling her I was far too much of a gentleman to answer that specific question honestly. She groaned again, shifting her weight to sit up quickly, but a wild curl of her dark hair caught tightly on the top button of my shirt. We both froze instantly, locked in an awkward, tight proximity. Claire stared at the button for a second, and then she began to laugh, a soft, embarrassed sound that vibrated against my chest. She joked that this was exactly how she was destined to die, strangled to death by sudden emotional intimacy. I reached up with one hand, carefully untangling the dark strand of hair from the plastic button. I told her that since she had successfully survived the terrifying historic basement, she could certainly survive a single shirt button. She looked up at me, her laughter fading, and whispered that I couldn't possibly know that for sure. When the strand finally slid free, my fingers lingered for half a fraction of a second against the soft skin of her cheek. I fully intended to pull my hand back, to restore the safe boundaries of daylight, but my hand simply refused to move. Claire noticed the hesitation instantly. The entire bedroom fell completely quiet, the distant sound of morning traffic hummed outside, and her crooked smile transitioned into something infinitely warmer. The heavy sleep had softened all of her sharp defensive edges. Standing there in the morning light, She looked significantly less like the sarcastic woman who had challenged me in the hallway yesterday afternoon. Instead, she looked like someone standing tentatively at the open doorway of her own heart, trying to decide if she was brave enough to let me see the messy reality inside. I cleared my throat slightly, my voice rough from sleep, and murmured a quiet morning to her. She held my gaze, her eyes fixed on mine, and whispered, "A morning back." I wanted to kiss her. I wanted it so badly, it felt like a physical ache in my chest. But I had learned through hard experience that wanting something wasn't the same thing as taking it, and I had realized far too late in life that true tenderness matters the most when it actually has the discipline to stop and wait. So, instead of leaning in, I brushed my thumb once, very lightly, over the back of her hand and asked if she wanted some coffee. Claire's expression changed instantly. It wasn't disappointment that crossed her features. It was a flash of pure, playful challenge. She tilted her head, looking at me with a mix of amusement and disbelief, and noted that I was actively offering her a beverage instead of kissing her properly. My brain completely stopped functioning for a second. I stammered slightly, explaining that I was simply trying to be entirely respectful of her situation. She called my behavior very noble, her voice dripping with a mild, teasing annoyance that I found incredibly endearing. She asked if I honestly thought she wanted me to be respectful right now. I looked at her, my pulse quickening, and asked if she wanted me to be less respectful. She leaned slightly closer, her green eyes locking onto mine with absolute clarity. She told me that she simply wanted me to be brave enough to actually ask for what I wanted. There it was again. Claire, moving toward me without a single flinch, refusing to shrink herself down or hide behind defensive humor. She wasn't looking for a savior or a man to rescue her from a leaking apartment. She was simply choosing me out of her own free will. My chest tightened with a feeling that was terrifyingly vast. I looked at her lips, then back to her eyes, and asked the question out loud. "Can I kiss you?" Her answer came without a single second of hesitation. Yes, and it. The kiss was incredibly gentle at first, barely more than a soft, lingering question brushed against her lips. Her mouth was warm, soft, and carried a tiny hint of hesitation until I raised my hand to cup her jawline. The moment my skin touched hers, she let out a soft breath that sounded exactly like total relief, and she leaned her entire weight into me. She kissed me back then, not like a woman who was falling apart at the seams, but like a woman who was actively coming back to her own strength. Her slender fingers slid up to rest against my jaw, while my hand settled firmly at her waist over the faded fabric of the old gray t-shirt. The simple, undeniable fact of holding her close made the entire bedroom feel far too bright, far too small, and completely full of everything I had spent the last 2 years forcefully refusing to want. When we finally broke apart to breathe, she remained incredibly close, her forehead resting against mine. She let out a breathless laugh, whispering that the kiss was absolutely terrible for her ongoing plan to remain deeply mysterious. I smiled against her skin, telling her I was beginning to suspect her great mystery was composed entirely of wet cardboard boxes. She laughed out loud against my shoulder, and I wrapped my arm tightly around her waist, simply because she had moved into my space first. We eventually got out of bed and made coffee in my small kitchen, the city power grid having finally roared back to life while we were talking. Claire sat flat on the clean laminate counter, her bare feet swinging back and forth. She was wearing my gray shirt along with a pair of my old gray sweatpants that she had rolled up 3 separate times at the ankle just to keep them from swallowing her feet. She watched my every movement as if measuring coffee grounds was the most fascinating spectacle in the world. She remarked that I was incredibly precise with my measurements. I told her it was just regular coffee, a standard morning beverage, not a high-stakes hostage negotiation. She reminded me that she usually drank terrible gas station coffee, so my level of care felt alien to her. I turned around, holding a warm blue mug in my hand, and told her I was simply trying to save her from her own bad taste. Claire looked down at the mug, her playful teasing softening into something much deeper. She warned me to be very careful, because if a man improves a woman's standards far too much, she might actually decide to never leave his side. The heavy word landed squarely between us in the quiet kitchen. I took a step closer, looking directly into her green eyes, and told her that would be perfectly fine with me. Her smile became incredibly soft and genuine. She repeated the word back to me like a promise. Good. I handed her the hot coffee. She took a slow sip, closed her eyes in pure appreciation, and announced that, unfortunately for her independence, I was proving to be remarkably useful around here. I told her I appreciated the high praise, warning her not to get too arrogant about it. She laughed, telling me it was already far too late for that. Her bare foot swung out, lightly tapping against my thigh, a tiny, casual touch that felt like a quiet, undeniable claim on my space. For breakfast, I scrambled some eggs and toasted a few slices of bread. She immediately accused me of preparing first date eggs, mock complaining that if this was an official date, my manners were actually terrible because I hadn't bothered to bring her flowers. Without missing a beat, she hopped off the kitchen counter, slipped past me, and disappeared across the narrow hallway into her own apartment. 10 minutes later, she walked back into my kitchen holding the dead houseplant from the night before, presenting it to me with absolute, deadpan solemnity. She announced that it was a gift for me. I stared at the dry, brown leaves drooping over the ceramic pot, completely amused. I told her the plant was very clearly deceased. Claire nodded, stating that the plant was deeply symbolic. I asked her what on earth it was supposed to symbolize. She looked at me, a brilliant flash of mischief in her eyes, and told me it represented her entire dating history. I laughed so incredibly hard, I nearly burned the remaining toast on the stove. We ended up eating breakfast at my tiny wooden kitchen table, while the morning sunlight slowly replaced the remnants of the midnight storm outside. It really should have felt incredibly awkward, two near strangers sharing a quiet domestic breakfast after a single night that had turned far too intimate far too quickly. But instead of feeling forced or strange, it felt completely easy. It felt dangerously, beautifully easy. After we finished eating, Claire went back across the hall to her own apartment to call her landlord, take a proper shower, and fully assess the physical damage to her bedroom floor. I immediately offered to come along and help her clean up the mess, but she lifted a single finger to stop me in my tracks. She told me there would be absolutely no fixing her entire life before noon. I smiled, leaning against the doorframe, and told her I was only offering dry towels and a bit of emotional remodeling. She rolled her eyes playfully, claiming she had seen the project manager look in my eyes, calling it an occupational hazard. Then, her smile faded slightly, and she took a step closer to me in the narrow hallway. And she told me she genuinely liked that I wanted to help her. But she paused, her voice turning incredibly serious. She said she needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that she could choose to stay in this building without feeling like she owed me a debt for her rescue. The words stopped me completely, hitting me like a physical blow, because I knew right away that she was entirely right. I had spent the majority of my adult life, especially during my failed marriage, making myself entirely indispensable to people who needed fixing. My ex-wife used to tell me that I intentionally made myself essential to her life and then acted deeply hurt when she became dependent on me to handle her emotions. At the time, I had thought her critique was deeply unfair and cruel. But now, with Claire looking at me with absolute clarity, hoping I would understand her boundaries, I wondered if my ex-wife's words had contained a bitter seed of truth. So, I looked at Claire and simply nodded my head, accepting her terms. I told her, okay. Her left eyebrow lifted in surprise. She repeated the word, asking if I was truly okay with that. I told her I would bring her fresh towels, I would drink her coffee, and I would absolutely kiss her again if I was properly invited to do so. But I promised I would never try to take over her life. Her mouth curved into a beautiful, relieved smile. She noted that my last promise sounded like it was going to be incredibly difficult for a man like me to keep. I told her it was going to be absolute agony. She laughed softly, telling me that personal growth was supposed to be a little painful. Then, she leaned up on her tiptoes and kissed me quickly on the lips, a soft, fleeting pressure that was over before I even had a chance to properly react. She smiled over her shoulder, telling me that was my motivation for the day. By the early hours of the afternoon, her apartment had turned into a full-scale operation. I had brought over two large floor fans that were blowing at full blast. Dry towels were lined up along the baseboards, and every single window in apartment, 3B, was thrown wide open to let the humid mountain air circulate. Her landlord had officially promised to send a plumber later in the week, using the classic, unhelpful phrase, "These things happen." The line had made Claire so angry she had immediately put the man on speakerphone so I could silently witness the incredible array of disgusted facial expressions she was making at the wall. At exactly 4 o'clock, she stood directly in the middle of her hollow living room, her hands planted firmly on her hips. She looked around the space and loudly announced to the empty air that she was officially staying in Asheville. My heart did something incredibly embarrassing against my ribs, a sudden flutter of joy that I tried desperately to hide. She caught my expression and clarified quickly that she was staying for now, and that her decision was absolutely not because of me. I smiled, agreeing completely, stating that she was staying purely out of a noble refusal to be defeated by ancient apartment plumbing. She laughed, but then she looked at me, the defensive bravado completely thinning from her face. She stepped closer, her green eyes vulnerable, and told me that last night was the first time, in a very long time, that she hadn't felt entirely stupid for wanting something soft and gentle from life. I set down the heavy cardboard box I had been carrying for her and looked at her directly. I asked her what she truly wanted right now. Her eyes held mine with absolute certainty. She told me she wanted a real, traditional first date, one where she wasn't completely damp from a storm, technically homeless, or wearing my oversized gray sweatpants. I smiled, telling her that I had actually really liked the sweatpants on her. She laughed, telling me of course I would, given my strange obsession with sorting things. Then she asked if we could do dinner tonight. I stepped closer to her, my voice turning smooth and deliberate. I looked into her green eyes and asked the question properly. Claire, will you please go on a real date with me tonight? She smiled beautifully, her eyes bright, and told me yes. But she immediately added that she was going to be the one choosing the restaurant. I asked her why she needed to choose, and she laughed, stating that if she let a project manager choose the location, we would undoubtedly end up at a restaurant that featured perfectly labeled napkins. Before I could even formulate a clever answer to her tease, someone knocked loudly on her open front door. It wasn't the polite, annoyed tap of Mark from downstairs, and it wasn't a casual neighborly knock. It was two sharp, aggressive taps that instantly made the entire room feel incredibly cold. Claire turned around toward the doorway, and in a fraction of a second, every single drop of warmth completely drained from her face. A man was standing directly in her open doorway. He had wet, styled blonde hair, an incredibly charming smile on his face, and a pair of cold, calculating blue eyes that didn't match his warm expression at all. He looked into the room, locked his eyes onto Claire, and spoke with a smooth, practiced voice that made my jaw instantly clench. He smiled and said, "Hey, Claire, we really need to talk." For one long, agonizing second, nobody in the apartment moved a single muscle. Daniel stood, framed in the open doorway, like an actor who had practiced his entrance in front of a mirror for weeks. He looked exactly like the kind of man who never had to worry about crooked floorboards or spirited water pressure. He was holding a large, expensive bouquet of white tulips, their pristine petals looking completely out of place against the damp, chaotic backdrop of a half-unpacked apartment. He wore a crisp, tailored jacket that didn't have a single wrinkle, and his clean leather shoes didn't bear a single trace of the heavy summer storm that had just ravaged the city. His cold, blue eyes swept over the interior of the room, taking in the whirring floor fans, the damp towels lined up along the baseboards, and finally, his gaze settled on me. He let out a soft, mocking chuckle, his voice perfectly smooth and controlled. He looked back at Claire and remarked that she certainly didn't waste any time moving on. I felt the muscles in my jaw flex instantly, a sharp wave of protective anger rushing straight to my knuckles. Every instinct I possessed as a man told me to step directly in front of Claire, to block her from his view and force him out of her space. But just as I made a subtle move to step forward, I remembered the exact words she had whispered to me in the hallway earlier that afternoon. She had told me she needed to know she could choose to stay in this city without feeling like she owed me a debt for her rescue. She didn't need another man to fight her battles or treat her like a fragile piece of property. She needed to stand on her own 2 feet. So, I deliberately stayed exactly where I was, standing firmly beside her, rather than putting myself ahead of her. Claire noticed the hesitation immediately. Her green eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second, and I saw something steady and resilient lock into place behind her gaze. The visible tremor in her hands completely vanished. She took a slow, deep breath, turned her face back toward the doorway, and told Daniel with absolute calmness that he needed to leave her apartment immediately. His practiced smile tightened slightly at the corners, a brief flash of irritation breaking through his handsome facade. He told her that he had just driven 4 long hours through a torrential downpour to see her, adding that he had been deeply worried about her safety. Claire didn't flinch. She shook her head, her voice remaining completely steady, and told him that the long drive was entirely his own choice. She informed him that he wasn't actually worried about her safety, he was simply inconvenienced by the fact that she was no longer under his control. Daniel's eyes hardened, the smooth charm beginning to peel away to reveal the cold, critical man underneath. He gestured dismissively with the bouquet of white tulips toward the messy room, letting out another soft, condescending laugh. He asked her if this disaster was truly what she wanted for her life, a leaking, broken, historic apartment and some random guy she had met yesterday. Claire took one deliberate step forward, not toward him, but away from the old, apologetic version of herself that she had spent years trapped inside. She looked him directly in the eyes and told him that Ryan was completely beside the point, adding that this was the exact concept he had never been able to understand. Her choice to leave him wasn't about finding another man to take his place, she explained. It was entirely about finding herself. Daniel's expression shifted from irritation to a cold, familiar condescension. He stepped slightly closer to the threshold, using his height to try and dominate the space, and told her not to be so dramatic. The word made Claire flinch, just barely, a tiny shadow of old pain crossing her face. It was obvious that he had used that exact word against her 1,000 times before to invalidate her feelings and make her doubt her own reality. She hated the fact that she had shown weakness in front of him, and she hated even more that I had witnessed it. Her chin lifted immediately, her spine turning to steel, and she told him that she wasn't being dramatic at all, she was simply completely done with him. The entire hallway fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the low, monotonous hum of the floor fans. Daniel turned his cold blue eyes back to me, trying to draw me into an alliance against her. He told me that I should be careful, claiming that Claire always made everything significantly bigger than it actually was. He warned me that she would get incredibly emotional over nothing and then expect someone else to step in and clean up her mess. Claire inhaled sharply, her shoulders tensing as she prepared to defend herself against the cruel evaluation. But before she could even open her mouth, I heard my own voice cut through the quiet room, completely bypassing my usual professional caution. I looked directly at Claire, ignoring the man in the doorway entirely, and told her that I actually really liked her mess. Both of them turned to look at me in absolute shock. For the record, I added with a small smile, I thought her mess was the most interesting thing in this entire building. A tiny, completely stunned laugh escaped Claire's lips, the tight tension in her face instantly breaking apart. Daniel's features darkened immediately, his charming facade completely slipping away to reveal a bitter, ugly anger. He sneered, muttering that my comment was incredibly cute. Claire stepped directly into his line of sight, her voice carrying a heavy, undeniable authority. She told him that what was truly cute was his arrogant belief that she still required his permission to be believed. She walked all the way to the front door, gripped the brass handle, and held it completely wide open. She looked him dead in the eye and said a final goodbye. Daniel stared at her for a long, silent moment, the air in the hallway turning thick and dangerously tight. He realized then that his words no longer carried any power over her mind. He slowly bent down and set the pristine white tulips flat on the dirty floorboards like a deliberate punishment. He told her coldly that she would undoubtedly call him the moment her new life inevitably fell apart. Claire smiled a small, crooked smile that carried absolutely no warmth and told him that she never would. Then, she slammed the heavy wooden door completely shut in his face. For a long, breathless minute, she simply stood there with her back to me, her palms pressed flat against the solid wood of the door. I didn't rush across the room to touch her. I wanted to hold her more than I wanted my next breath, but I forced myself to wait until she was ready to turn around on her own terms. When she finally faced me, her green eyes were swimming with unshed tears, and her lower lip was trembling violently with the immense effort it took not to break down crying. She looked at me, a wild, disbelieving look in her eyes, and whispered that she had actually done it. I nodded my head slowly, confirming the truth. I told her she absolutely had. She let out a shaky, breathless laugh, wiping a single stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand, and confessed that she felt like she was going to throw up. I smiled gently, telling her that vomiting didn't exactly sound like a victorious celebration. She laughed again, agreeing that it was just the painful reality of personal growth. I slowly opened my arms wide, standing near the kitchen counter, but I didn't take a single step toward her. I left the decision entirely up to her. Claire looked at my open arms, crossed the empty room with quick, determined steps, and threw her entire weight into my chest. She came into my embrace, like she had made the decision long before I had even offered it. I held her tightly against me while the floor fans continued to blow warm summer air around us, and the expensive white tulips sat completely abandoned out in the empty hallway. After a long minute of quiet, her voice came out muffled against the fabric of my t-shirt. She asked me if I truly meant what I said about liking her mess. I rested my chin gently on the top of her dark hair, inhaling the faint scent of rain, and told her that I always mean exactly what I say. She tilted her face up to look at me, her green eyes searching mine, and complained that I kept doing that. I asked her what I kept doing, and she whispered that I kept saying things that made it incredibly difficult for her to remain cynical about life. I reached up with my thumb, gently brushing a fresh tear away from her pale skin, and offered a quiet apology. She smiled beautifully, telling me that I wasn't actually sorry at all. I smiled back, admitting that I wasn't. Her gaze dropped slowly to my mouth, the lingering shadows of her past completely vanishing from her eyes. And this time, she didn't wait for me to ask for permission. She leaned up on her tiptoes and kissed me first. It wasn't the careful, hesitant morning kiss we had shared in the bedroom. This kiss carried a fierce sense of total relief, a touch of lingering anger, a massive dose of personal triumph, and the sweet, shaky vulnerability of a woman completely choosing what came next in her life. Her fingers gripped the fabric of my shirt tightly, pulling me closer, while my hands settled around her slender waist, drawing her against me until I could feel the rapid, steady beat of her heart against my own ribs. When she finally pulled back, a real, brilliant smile lit up her entire face. She whispered that the kiss was officially the end of her plan to remain mysterious. I laughed out loud, wrapping my arm securely around her shoulders, and told her that Ryan was officially the point of her day now. We did not cancel our dinner plans that evening. Claire insisted on going out with the absolute ferocity of a person who had just discovered she possessed the incredible power to close doors on her past. 2 hours later, she was standing directly in my bathroom doorway while I was attempting to button my clean shirt. She leaned against the frame and announced that she flatly refused to let Daniel be the most memorable man she encountered today. I looked up from my shirt button and instantly lost the capacity to speak. She was wearing a beautiful green silk dress that made the color of her eyes look completely impossible, and her dark hair was hanging completely loose and wavy around her shoulders. She wore no defensive armor, offered no apologies for her appearance, and carried no lingering hesitation. She was just entirely Claire, soft, sharp, and bright enough to completely ruin my structured peace forever. She noticed my silence, a playful smirk touching her lips, and noted that I was actively staring at her. I told her that I absolutely was. She asked if I had any professional notes on her appearance. I told her I had several notes, but none of them were remotely appropriate for an official first date. A delicate, beautiful flush of pink rushed into her cheeks. She stepped closer to me, her high heels clicking softly against the floorboards, and reached up to gently straighten the collar of my shirt. She noted that I cleaned up remarkably well for a man who actively flirt-hearted with storage labeling systems. I looked down at her dress, noting that she had worn green on purpose. She smiled up at me, her eyes sparkling in the dim light, and confirmed that she had. I asked her why she chose that color, and she whispered that she wore it simply because she knew I always noticed her eyes. I had absolutely no logical defense against that kind of honesty. The restaurant she had chosen for our first official date was a small, bustling Italian place tucked away in a historic brick alley downtown. The interior was loud, crowded, and completely lit by red glass candles sitting on the checkered tablecloths. The menus were completely handwritten on chalkboards, and the air smelled heavily of fresh garlic, red wine, and warm bread. It really should have felt far too soon for us to be sitting across from one another, given the immense emotional wreckage that had occurred in her hallway only a few hours prior. Instead, as I sat across from her, watching her casually steal French fries directly off my porcelain plate, I felt something incredibly tight and guarded inside my own chest, completely unclench. I wasn't magically fixed, and I wasn't entirely healed from my own past divorce, but for the first time in 2 years, I was completely willing to try. Halfway through the meal, she caught me staring at her through the warm glow of the red candle. She paused, her fork hovering in the air, and asked me what I was doing. I rested my chin on my hand, looking directly at her, and told her I was simply trying to memorize this exact moment. Her fork lowered slightly, her eyebrows knitting together in gentle curiosity as she asked me why. I told her the absolute truth. I explained that just yesterday morning, I had firmly believed that the absolute best thing I could ever hope for out of my life was just a bit of clean, quiet isolation. Claire's expression softened completely, the vibrant green of her eyes reflecting the dancing flame of the candle. She whispered a question, asking me what I was hoping for now. I leaned across the table, my voice dropping into a low, steady murmur, and told her that right now, I was desperately hoping she would decide to order a large dessert. Simply so I would have a legitimate excuse to stay at this table with her for a little while longer. She looked down instantly, a beautiful smile breaking across her face as she looked into her half-empty wine glass. She noted that my comment was almost remarkably smooth. I smiled, teasing her about the word almost, and she looked up, claiming that I had hesitated slightly at the end. I told her I was completely distracted by the beautiful woman who was actively stealing my food. She laughed softly, stating that the woman sounded incredibly charming. I held her gaze through the candlelight and told her that she absolutely was. After we finished dinner, we chose to walk all the way back to our building instead of calling a rideshare vehicle. The summer storm had completely scrubbed the entire city clean, leaving the air feeling crisp, cool, and smelling heavily of wet leaves and summer asphalt. The yellow streetlights glittered beautifully in the shallow puddles along the sidewalk, reflecting the historic architecture of the mountain town. Halfway up the steep hill leading toward our street, Claire quietly slipped her small hand into mine. There was no sudden emergency this time. There was no dark basement to navigate, and no flickering power outage to force our contact. It was just her hand, completely warm, dry, and certain, locking its fingers securely between mine. She looked down at our joined hands, her voice a quiet reflection against the night air, and noted that both of us knew this situation was moving incredibly fast. I nodded, telling her that I was fully aware of the speed. She added that she wasn't ready to promise me anything huge or permanent yet. I squeezed her hand gently, telling her that I wasn't asking for any promises. She glanced up at me through the shadows of the trees, a playful glint in her eyes, and asked if I wanted to ask for them. I stopped walking for a fraction of a second, looking down at the way her small fingers fit perfectly into the palm of my hand. I looked up, met her beautiful green eyes under the streetlight, and told her, yes. Her thumb brushed gently over the back of my knuckles, and she smiled a warm, crooked smile. She warned me not to get too dramatic on her. I laughed softly, stepping back into stride beside her, and promised her that I would never do that. She scoffed playfully, reminding me that I owned a professional label maker, which meant I was practically built for drama. When we finally reached her apartment door on the third floor, we noticed that the expensive bouquet of white tulips was completely gone from the floorboards. In their place, Mark from apartment 2B had left a small, neat note written on a piece of lined paper that read, "Free sad flowers, waste not." Claire laughed so incredibly hard at the note that she had to physically lean her entire weight against the drywall of the hallway just to stay upright. After her laughter finally faded into a soft, tender sigh, she turned her green eyes toward me. She reached into her small purse, pulled out her brass key, and asked me to come inside. I smiled, my voice carrying a deep, quiet certainty, and told her that I absolutely would. Claire's apartment was still a labyrinth of half-empty boxes and looming towers of unread paperbacks, but the heavy scent of moisture and old plaster had completely dissolved. Instead, the small space was slowly discovering its own unique identity, breathing in the quiet aroma of fresh earth, burning vanilla candles, and a continuous stream of hot, strong coffee. Claire had officially abandoned her reliance on low-grade gas station fuel, though she frequently teased me that my precise, weighed pour-overs lacked the inherent sense of daily danger and survival she had grown to love. The tragic, thoroughly desiccated houseplant from her first evening had not survived our aggressive attempts at residential botanical resuscitation. We had given it a remarkably solemn, completely sarcastic funeral service inside a cardboard takeout container before walking down to a local greenhouse to locate a suitable replacement. We eventually marched back up to the third floor, carrying a massive, incredibly unruly Boston fern that we officially named Mark. Claire claimed the plant was a perfect fit for the building because it was visually dramatic, highly sensitive to environmental changes, and only truly thrived in conditions of extreme, suffocating humidity. By the time the autumn leaves began to shed their brilliant amber and gold hues across the Blue Ridge Parkway, Claire and I had slowly carved out a reliable, beautiful rhythm to our joint existence. We had established an unwritten, highly respected weekend treaty. Friday nights belonged entirely to her creative, unpredictable planning. This meant I spent my Friday evenings navigating crowded, avant-garde art gallery openings, waiting in long lines outside local taco trucks, attending independent bookstore poetry readings, and once, rather disastrously, sitting at a spinning pottery wheel where the lumpy gray clay bowl I attempted to shape looked like it had suffered a massive personal tragedy before collapsing into a sad puddle of mud. Sunday mornings, however, belonged entirely to my structured, predictable universe. This meant the kitchen smelled of heavy buttermilk pancakes precisely at 8 o'clock, followed by incredibly long, quiet walks through the historic neighborhoods of Montford and casual weekend furniture shopping, where both of us explicitly pretended we were just looking for fun, rather than actively hunting for items that could comfortably fit into a shared future. But true growth is rarely a smooth, upward trajectory. It tends to move forward in sudden, terrifying lurches that catch you completely off guard. For a man like me, who had spent 2 entire years building a flawless fortress of solitude behind labeled storage bins and an empty master bedroom, the actual danger didn't arrive in the form of a major storm or a dramatic confrontation with an angry ex-husband. It arrived on a mundane Tuesday afternoon, in the quiet form of a single plastic toothbrush. I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror, wiping a layer of steam from the glass after a long shower, when my eyes locked onto the white ceramic holder near the sink. Sitting perfectly upright beside my familiar blue toothbrush was a brand new lavender-colored plastic toothbrush. The bristles were completely dry, and the plastic handle bore a small, playful pattern of daisies. I froze completely, my bath towel clutched tightly in my hand. My breath caught in my throat as a sudden, irrational wave of panic slammed straight into my chest. I stared at the small lavender object as if it were a highly volatile, live military grenade that had been carelessly dropped onto my clean counter. To anyone else, it was just a standard tool for personal hygiene. To me, it looked like a massive, undeniable piece of domestic evidence. It was proof that someone was actively carving out a permanent space inside my carefully guarded borders. It meant my quiet little life of takeout containers and clean, empty countertops was officially under siege by a woman who packed her taxes near her silverware. Claire found me standing exactly like that, motionless, dripping wet, and staring down at the sink with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. She was leaning against the bathroom doorframe, a soft, amused smile playing on her lips as she watched the internal crisis play out across my features. She crossed her arms, tilted her head toward the sink, and asked me if we should officially give the lavender object a proper name. I turned my head slowly toward her, my voice coming out completely strained and rough. I asked her what on earth she was talking about. She gestured toward the porcelain holder, her green eyes sparkling with a mix of warmth and sharp, observant intelligence. She noted that I seemed to be deeply, emotionally involved with her new toothbrush, adding that she hadn't seen me stare at a project blueprint with that level of intense, suffocating concentration. A ragged, half-strangled laugh escaped my throat, but it lacked any real humor. I looked back down at the daisies on the handle, my knuckles turning white against the towel. I swallowed hard and confessed that the sight of it had caught me completely off guard. The playful amusement instantly vanished from Claire's face, replaced by a quiet, mature understanding that made my chest ache. She didn't get defensive, she didn't make a sharp, sarcastic joke to protect her own ego, and she didn't look hurt. She simply stepped into the small bathroom, closing the distance between us until the hem of her shirt brushed against my arm and gently took my hand in hers. She asked me quietly if the presence of the toothbrush felt like far too much for me right now. I desperately wanted to lie to her. Every proud, independent instinct I possessed urged me to look her in the eye and tell her that I was completely fine, that I was the healed man, the easy man, the secure partner who didn't flinch at small signs of domestic intimacy. But as I looked down at her slender fingers woven securely between mine, I remembered the promise we had made to each other under the amber glow of the emergency candles. So, I let out a long, ragged exhale, deflating against the counter, and admitted that it did feel a little overwhelming. Claire didn't close herself off from me. She simply nodded her head in acceptance, her grip remaining steady and warm. She looked up at me and promised that she had absolutely no desire to move into my structured life like a hostile corporate takeover. She explained that she valued my boundaries just as much as she valued her own newfound independence. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for months, the heavy tension radiating from my shoulders, finally beginning to melt away under her touch. But before I could even formulate a proper thank you, a classic, brilliant flash of mischief returned to her green eyes. She looked up at me, a crooked smile growing on her face, and added that while she was completely fine with a slow pace, she was definitely going to require some designated drawer space eventually. I looked down at her, a genuine laugh finally breaking through my lingering anxiety. I asked her exactly what size drawer we were currently discussing in her grand master plan. She grinned beautifully, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and joyfully announced to the bathroom mirror that my romantic inventory manager had officially returned to the room. I smiled, pulling her slender waist tightly against my chest, and kissed her thoroughly until her laughter completely dissolved against my mouth. 6 months after the live grenade incident in the bathroom, Claire's apartment no longer smelled of fresh cardboard boxes and industrial floor fans. The space had completely healed itself, breathing in a warm, welcoming aroma of fresh basil thriving on the windowsill, rich vanilla candles flickering on the wooden side tables, and the familiar scent of dark roast coffee. Claire had officially conceded that my precise morning pour-overs were superior to gas station brew, although she stubbornly maintained that she occasionally missed the raw sense of existential danger that came with drinking a cup of coffee purchased from a man wearing a name tag at 3 o'clock in the morning. Mark the Boston fern was flourishing beautifully in the bright living room window. He had grown so incredibly large and unruly that his green fronds actively blocked half of the mountain view, but neither of us had the heart to trim him back. He was dramatic. He required constant validation in the form of misted water, and he threw a visible tantrum by shedding his leaves if the indoor humidity dropped even a single percentage point. Claire constantly remarked that he was the absolute mascot of our relationship, an organic reminder of the night our world had completely collided. By the arrival of the following spring, our lives had woven themselves into a tapestry so tight it was impossible to tell where my boundaries ended and hers began. We had built a beautiful, unshakable routine out of our contrasting personalities. Friday nights remained entirely hers to conquer, which meant my project manager mind was forced to endure experimental outdoor theater productions, crowded food truck rallies in River Arts District, and late-night poetry readings where I understood approximately 10% of the metaphors, but thoroughly enjoyed the way the stage lights caught the green in her eyes. Sunday mornings remained entirely mine, defined by a slow stack of buttermilk pancakes, long walks through the botanical gardens, and casual furniture browsing, where both of us dropped the protective pretense of just looking and began actively using the word our. Then, on a crisp, rainy Thursday night, almost exactly 1 year to the day since she had first shattered my quiet life, a familiar sound echoed through my apartment. It was a sharp, distinct knock at my front door. I stood up from my kitchen table, leaving my work laptop open, and walked into the small hallway. My heart did a sudden, familiar flip against my ribs, a sensory throwback to the midnight storm of the previous July. When I pulled the heavy wooden door open, Claire was standing directly under the dim hallway light. She was completely barefoot, her dark hair hanging loose and wavy around her face, and she was tightly holding a single, heavy cardboard box against her chest. I looked down at the box. Right there on the cardboard, written in thick, aggressive black marker, was a fresh label that read, "Kitchen, definitely taxes." A slow, beautiful wave of total clarity washed over me, taking my breath away before I could even formulate a word. I leaned my shoulder against the wooden doorframe, mirroring the exact physical posture I had assumed the very first afternoon we met. I looked into her green eyes and told her she could either ask her question or continue to pretend she wasn't actively weaponizing office supplies against my emotional state. Her lower lip twitched with a small, crooked smile, but her eyes remained intensely serious and beautifully bright. She told me that she had officially received a formal legal notice from her landlord stating that her current lease was expiring in exactly 30 days. I nodded slowly, keeping my voice entirely steady. I told her that I was fully aware of the building's leasing schedule. She took a slow step forward, the cardboard box shifting slightly in her arms, and explained that her apartment was completely fine now. The radiator pipe was fixed, the floors were dry, and she was perfectly, undeniably capable of living entirely on her own. I looked at her, my heart expanding until it felt far too large for my chest, and asked her if she truly wanted to live alone. Claire swallowed hard, the last remaining walls of her old defensive armor completely melting away in the dim light of the hallway. She shook her head, her green eyes locking onto mine with an absolute, breathtaking certainty, and whispered that she didn't want to live alone anymore. There it was. There was no sudden physical emergency to force our hands this time. There was no midnight flood to create a temporary bridge between our worlds, no violent storm to mask her vulnerability, and no fear of a past ghost knocking at her door. It was just Claire, standing completely flat on her own 2 feet in a dry, quiet hallway, using her own free will to choose a future with me. My voice came out incredibly rough, completely stripped of my usual cautious reserve. I looked at her and asked her to clarify exactly what she was asking me. She stepped across my threshold, the box pressed against her chest, her eyes swimming with a mixture of immense bravery and profound hope. She looked at me from only inches away and repeated those 7 beautiful words. "Is there room in your bed?" A brilliant smile broke across my face, though my throat felt incredibly tight with unshed tears. I looked down at her, a low laugh escaping my chest, and told her that my approval carried a very strict set of structural conditions. Her left eyebrow lifted in sharp, playful amusement as she asked me what my conditions were. I reached out, took the heavy box from her slender arms, and set it down carefully on the hardwood floor inside my entryway. Then, I stepped back to her, reached up with both of my hands, and tenderly cupped her face, my thumbs smoothing over her cheekbones. I looked directly into her eyes and told her that I would only say yes if she promised to never leave tomorrow. Claire let out a breathless, beautiful laugh that broke directly into a deep, desperate kiss. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me against her with a force that felt like a total homecoming. We kissed right there in the narrow hallway where our story had first begun. Standing under the old, flickering, historic light, while the spring rain tapped softly against the window panes and our 2 apartment doors stood completely wide open on either side of us. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her green eyes dazzling in the light, and whispered into the space between us that she was never going to leave. By the arrival of the following spring, the physical evidence of our shared life was completely undeniable. There were officially 2 plastic toothbrushes sitting perfectly side by side in the white ceramic holder. Her green silk dress was hanging proudly in the center of my master closet, and my professional label maker had been relegated to a bottom drawer that she had deliberately labeled nerd equipment. Mark, the Boston fern, was flourishing beautifully in the windowsill, casting long, peaceful shadows across our living room floor. Our master bed never felt too large or too honest anymore. Some mornings, I woke up an hour before the alarm, resting my head on my arm, just to watch the soft morning sunlight move slowly across the smooth planes of her face. Occasionally, she would catch me watching her, her eyelashes fluttering open as she mumbled that my behavior was incredibly creepy but deeply affectionate, before reaching out her hand to pull me right back down under the warmth of the heavy covers. And every single time the summer rain began to lash against the glass, my mind would instantly drift back to that chaotic midnight hour, to a ruined mattress, a dead houseplant, and a beautiful, terrified woman who was brave enough to stand in my hallway and ask for a safe place to rest her head, and infinitely braver to stay when I asked her to risk her heart. I realized then that the physical room in my bed had never been the true question we were trying to answer. The real question was whether there was still room inside my guarded, lonely life to let love back in. Claire had answered that question perfectly by simply reaching out for my hand in the darkness of a power outage. And I had answered it by refusing to ever let go. What would you have done if your brand new neighbor knocked on your door in the middle of the night and asked if there was room in your bed, but you already knew deep down that you never wanted her to leave your side? Have you ever experienced a moment like that in your own life, meeting a complete stranger at the absolute strangest, most chaotic possible time, and watching your entire world instantly shift on its axis? Tell me your personal story down in the comments below. If you connected with this narrative, please leave a like on the video, hit that subscribe button to join our community, and I will see you all in the very next story.